I can
central
start
actually.
With today's assignment, which what led me back to it. I don't know if that would help.
Well,
but let's not do that.
Yeah, don't complicate that. Let's go to the easy part. Page 17
Page
is
17.
the locus of Adam's question.
1,
And
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 or 14 lines down. The sentence begins with this transcendental thinking. And so the reference up until this point is we're talking about the novitas mentis. So I was under the impression that this sentence was referring to the thinking now occurring about this transcendental thinking.
Well, which in a sense is correct, right? That
Right, it is.
This transcendental thinking, and then in the second clause, or the second sentence of that compound sentence, in its objectivity, it knows the schema of every object in its essential indifference to existence to be holding to difference itself. And your question, let me try and formulate it for you and you correct me. Your question was, had to do with the fact that the it presumably has to do with the new thinking, the transcendental thinking,
Right.
Transcendental thinking in this context, transcendental historical thinking, and is the schema of every object the way in which this thinking grasps the object, which was Adam's first reading, right, which is I think quite understandable because there's a certain difficulty in the text, but the question is very good because it enabled me through Adam's persistence to clarify it. That, in other words, yes, the it refers to the transcendental thinking, but the distinction between the object and its schema, okay, is a reference backwards to modern thinking. In other words, in modern thinking, there is a schema associated with the object, which I was just saying to Adam as we were about to start the class, is a kind of a trace of the notion of the idea, whether that idea be the Hegelian idea or the Cartesian idea. So the distinction between the knowing of the existence and the knowing of that existence in a schema or in the form of an idea or representatively, right? So the thinking now occurring recognizes that the difference between the object and its schema testifies to the fact that the object in that context is holding to its existence. There is there's a tension, there's an identification, there's a bringing together, but therefore there's a continuing difference, as it were, a distinction between the object and existence in the thinking that's one or another form of self-consciousness. And what is trying to be said in today's assignment, especially in Alpha, I was really interested to reread that because I hadn't read it in a long time. I was always afraid to reread it. I think I succeed, not without difficulty, but fundamentally in Alpha, I think that it's pretty well parsed out how it is that in thinking now, thinking has, as it were, an immediate, I want to say contact, but an immediate contact, an immediate grasp in some sense of the word, of the object, in which the object and its existence, and more fundamentally existence itself, are not distinguished. That nothing slips in between the thought and the object, so to speak. There's just no middle ground for which the schema here is pointing to, and therefore there's no inconsistency between the object's existence and its schema, or there's no inconsistency between the object and its existence as testified to by the fact that there is a schema associated with it in self-consciousness. That was pretty much the question. I think it was pretty much the answer I was trying to give him. But we will hopefully explore that in greater breadth and depth when we get to Alpha in a few minutes. Yeah.
I just have a very minor question about that sentence, which is, when you say this transcendental thinking comprehends, and my question is about the phrase, through its essence, are you saying as opposed to something else? Or are you just, is it just a redundancy there?
Right.
So it comes up a lot in
Yeah,
the way
right.
that you form your sentences, and I'm never quite sure.
Yeah, it's well. I mean, it's easy for me to say it's not simply a redundancy.
Okay.
It's more difficult to affirmatively lay out the significance of that, but through its essence, through its the very novelty and immediacy of its being for the first time in history, inseparable in some way from that fundamental quality of the thinking, right? That or that through its essence, it is that very aspect of the thinking which enables it to
Yes.
whatever the right to comprehend
Yeah.
that perpetual existence. Does that make any
Yeah.
sense? So
Yeah.
in that sense, I don't think it's redundant, but it's trying to point to the essentially new aspect of this thought. Other questions, objections, problems?
So
Yeah.
this is important to me in the sense
Yeah.
that of the relationship between what we were talking about earlier in terms of simplicity and
Yes.
multiplicity,
Yes,
almost.
yeah,
Because
yeah.
when I was reading it as I was,
Right.
to suggest that in the thinking now occurring, an object held to difference itself.
Yeah, no, that would be right.
That would have implied that there was this tension within
Right.
the thinking now occurring.
It would have been an anti-simplicity notion.
Anti-simplicity
Right,
notion. But I thought it might be referring to so simple that it could be.
No.
But it-
No. So the fact that you stumbled on that says your basic understanding of what we're talking about is correct. And if this was referring to what we're supposed to be talking about, there would be a problem.
Would be a problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's referring to the distinction between schema and the object in previous thought. Okay. Any other questions,
Well, the
observations?
point about
Yeah.
the new thinking is that it transcends difference itself. Is that correct? It acknowledges difference, but it transcends it.
Well, it does. Literally, it would be true, but I'm hearing in the intonation of the use of transcendence there that it is somehow simply beyond difference itself, but it transcends it. Well, yes and no. In other words, it transcends.
I'll write down yes.
No, but that's the problem.
I'll write down yes and no.
That's it. You got it.
Okay.
It transcends difference itself. And this is again, in alpha, this is what's going on, the fundamental project of alpha, as it were, which is no project, right? Well, let me just jump to the basic idea that you should get out of alpha. One of the most fundamental ideas, that in some sense, thinking now has no, as it were, identity of its own, or another way of putting that, as it were, it has no pre-existent identity, did you say? Now, the analog of that, the corollary better of that, is that the object also, in a certain sense, unlike the object of past thinking, is so absolutely now the object of thought that I could put it loosely, as it were, but more than as it were, but just for openers, its past as an object is irrelevant to thinking, right? The object is, as it were, ex nihilo in thinking now, right? So now, if the thinking that, as it were, grasps, I don't like the word, right? Knows better, right? Perceives, conceives the object, has no identity of its own, then in some sense that object is its identity, right? Insofar as it has that object, in some sense it takes its identity from the object, right? And now, it doesn't take its identity from the object. It doesn't literally take its identity from the object, because then we would introduce the gap again. We would introduce an implicit self that's going to grasp its object. That's why the language is really a problem here, right? You see, but to the extent to which there is an immediate filling of what otherwise would be an identityless consciousness, in that sense, the object and the existence itself, right? There can be that can be the object identically. In that sense, it is transcendent to the thinking. But it's not transcendent to the thinking in the Aristotelian sense of the act of knowing being transcendent to reason as something above and beyond or outside of reason. Right? So we have a new notion. The notion of transcendence that's creating this ambiguity is not new with the thinking now occurring. I was going to say it begins with the phenomenological move of people like Husserl, that transcendence is not something above and beyond, outside of the grasp of reason, or in this case of intellect, but it refers to the distinction, as it were, in fact the difference between the thinking and the object, which is in the act of knowing, the identity of that thinking. So the simplest reduction of it would be that identity and transcendence are not any longer alternatives. Or another way of putting it, identity and difference are in no sense alternatives in the thinking now occurring. And so as it were again, proximity of the object and the thought. Right? I made some notes when we actually turn the pages to Alpha. And I've thought this over the years, roughly, but I can see it now in rereading Alpha, that it's fairly precise if you can have the patience with the text. What's going on in the thinking now occurring is, interestingly enough, a very interesting analogy to that peculiar thing in Aristotle of the identity of the knower and the known. Do you see? The identity of the knower and known, however, in Aristotle is something that we identify with the act of knowing, which transcends reason's method of operation, so to speak, you see, and which is a kind of a black box to reason. If you can imagine, try and imagine that we have here an identity of the knower and the known, but it's not something beyond reason, but reason has been radically newly shaped, such that it now, as such, in a way which is perceptive, sees the object as it were, identically itself. So so something of that transparency that is introduced into the relationship between knowledge and the object in Thomas Aquinas, right? However, mediated by his version of the schema, which is called a likeness in Thomas, the similitudo. Do you see? Okay. So start there. There are many different ways. As long as you get there, you can come down different streets when you get to the center of the town. All right. In the center of the town, what you want to coming down the Thomistic Street, you come down the Thomistic Street and you take that openness, that transparency, as it were, of the mind to the object as other. You see, which is, and he wants to maintain the Aristotelian identity of the knower and the known, so he identifies the act, the knowing act, with the species qua similitudo of the object. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay, but what is the gift of Thomas? The gift of Thomas is that the object, that other, is now the object of knowledge for Thomas, right? Because he's an Aristotelian, he has to understand there's an identity of the knower and the known, right? But he's seeing he never loses sight of the object in the transcendental form of reason. You see, he doesn't lose sight of the object in the act of knowledge, and he's as the object as other than the knower, and yet he knows as an Aristotelian there must be an identity. So the identity is in the similitudo which the mind grasps, and through which it knows the object. Do you see? It knows the object through, and it knows the object, in knowing the object through the similitudo, through the intelligible species, it knows that it's not involved in any kind of solipsism. You see? Because the intelligible species, the schema, the similitude, the likeness, is the instrument by means of which, by definition you could say, it's the instrument by means of which it knows the object. And therefore not to be itself. It knows the object as something other than itself. So if you come down the street toward the center of town, in the center of town, what's new here, and what is, in some sense, it's an achievement like Aristotle's achievement in the act of knowing, in the act of knowledge, the identity of the known and the known. It's like Aristotle in that respect. It's like Thomas insofar as it is not beyond reason, but it's within the context of a transcendental historical reason, you say. It can be both in some way Thomistic and in some way Aristotelian. If I take out of Thomas's rendition the schema, the schematic, if I take out the likeness, if I take out the middle term, so to speak, with which we are very comfortable, certainly historically and maybe even just as a matter of habit. So another way of putting it is that this is a non-habitual form of thinking, right? Right? And that corresponds to the fact that the substance of what is being known is radically, essentially, depending on the context, absolutely new, now, right? And therefore, the form appropriate to grasping this non-schematic, this object sans its schema, the form appropriate to grasping that cannot be an habitual form. Essentially so, if I can put that one. Does that make any sense? I forget who asked the question. Okay. But anyways, it's oh, you did. Okay. Go on. I thought you did.
A couple questions back, but I can see the analogies to Aristotle and Aquinas. I can't see the novelty. I can see the novelty of the new thinking, but I don't see the essential novelty of it. Precisely because to explain it, you have to resort, or, sorry, not you, but one has to resort to these antecedents, and that I think is the problem in conferring this monumental title on this new way of talking, thinking, approaching, whatever. That it apparently, in order to say anything, it has to posit historical differences, and it has to state them, shall we say, not posit them. And then it has to say, well, you know, they used to think this and used to think that. Guess what? They're now, there they are. They're right there. Just take a look at them. Imminently so.
Okay.
Right?
All right. Well, I think that's a fair objection. It's an objection you've made over the years in different forms. But I like that particular form of the objections, and I like the fact that we have it on tape, because the key word there is explain. It's the difference between explaining the thinking now occurring, which, yes, has to explain itself, right? It has to keep making reference to these other guys. But to be enacted, the act of thinking the now occurring needs no explanation. If you're actually thinking the essentially new, there's no explaining to be done. So it's when you're talking about the thinking now occurring, right, that you have this continual need to refer back. It's not when you are, as it were, doing the thinking now occurring, you see? And so that now I have to go back to the original, like day one of the course, right? In other words, how do you justify this impossible text, right? Well, the impossible text, ideally, I'm not saying it's perfectly done, okay, I understand. But nevertheless, the ideal that justifies the difficulty is that the reader, sooner or later, maybe on the third or fourth or fifth reading, will get beyond explaining the text to him or herself and will actually find themselves thinking the new thinking. You see? And that's what happens. I've had reports from people over the years, not in this room, I mean. Actually, there are a few other people as crazy as us in the world. And over the years, every once in a while, I'll get an email from somebody.
They'd be here today, but they're all locked up.
Right. Well, they didn't get the word. But the point being that, I mean, but it's good empirical. It's good empirical testimony. In other words, people will, every once in a while, every 5 or 10 years, send me an email saying that, you know, that they read this thing, it was impossible, and then they read it again, and it was really still near impossible. And then all of a sudden, right, the fourth time or whatever, yeah, it was perfectly clear to them. Well, my explanation for that would be, it was perfectly clear at the point when they stopped explaining it to themselves or having to explain it to themselves and began actually to forced eventually by the text to be thinking what the text is saying, right? Which is beyond explanation. So I think I like the question because it enables me to make that distinction, which I think is valid. I think it's valid between explaining it and doing it. Okay. Yeah.
While you're on doing it,
okay.
One question that has arisen for me, and I know other people as well, is the notion of the active contemplation of the Novitas Mentis.
Mm-hmm.
And is that a praxis? Is there a notion of intentionality that one must do it and have that active contemplation? Because that seems to take away from the notion that it is what is occurring, period.
Right. Yeah, no, it has more to do with what we were touching on last time, which needs to be, and will be, I hope, again in Alpha, clarified. One of the notes we came to last time, I think Chuck asked me about, talk a little bit about the history as the identity of the story and the storyteller, and the way the way my answer evolved in responding to Chuck. I was led to say things like, we got into the notion that the thinking in some sense is creative, right? It's in some sense, some real and important sense, creating the world. It's creating the reality in some sense. And just give me the essence of your question again, so
Praxis.
Yeah. Active contemplation. So active in that sense. Now, whatever that sense, we need to explore that. But active in that sense. And my thought is, again, I don't know about praxis, right? But my sense is that it's not praxis in the sense in which you're asking the question. It's not a technique to be acquired, which is what praxis, and as I'm hearing you, suggests to me. If I'm right about what you're implying,
right.
No, it doesn't mean that. Yeah.
Well, you refer to it as a contemplative judgment, and
Mm-hmm.
I have the feeling that then was a process of thinking.
Yes, right. That's right.
Which doesn't separate itself from, or the act of contemplation is not. It's a separate thing from what you were describing as contemplative judgment.
Where is it?
It's in Alpha.
Okay, so maybe we'll get to it. Okay. Yes.
One general question.
Yeah.
To make the distinction between talking about and doing the thinking now
Mm-hmm.
occurring, which makes perfectly good sense to me, it makes me want to raise the question about the difference between talking about the thinking now occurring
Mm-hmm.
and talking about what precedes it, the thinking that precedes it. Namely,
Well, okay.
yeah, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I mean, in a sense, it seems impossible to talk about it, that there's always a sort of, but I just wondering.
Yeah. Well, it is impossible. That's why the text is so difficult. In some sense, it is impossible to talk about it, more so, as it were. Now, of course, if you said to Hegel would appreciate the distinction because it's very important to him, and he has contempt for anybody who talks about things,
Right.
So, so that distinction is not new, and I think it's also true to say that the distinction becomes more problematic
Yes.
in the thinking now occurring. Which
But,
also.
but I guess what my question is it possible to characterize the difference between talking about the
Right.
thinking now occurring and talking about the thinking that precedes?
Well, I guess it would depend on who you ask. I think in some sense it's easier to talk about the thinking preceding. The substantive reason why it might be somewhat easier to talk about the thinking preceding is that the thinking preceding is less demanding. It's more accommodating to self-consciousness, right? So this thinking, it's less, if you can imagine such a thing. Hegel would say it'd always be inappropriate for a philosopher to talk about thinking. But it's even, if you can imagine, it's even more so, or it might be infinitely more inappropriate to do so in some sense.
I guess I'm really asking about the nature of about and how that I just, I can think of various ways of talking about that, namely the impossibility of talking about, but nonetheless one tries.
Right, that's right.
Which I don't think applies to what precedes the thinking now occurring. So just the nature of talking about that's really, namely, what kind of philosophical distinction?
Is about.
Yeah. You know.
Well, I'm reminded. I wish she was here. I remember a comment that Alia made one day in here when we started one of the classes, a few classes back. If I understood her correctly, she was making the comment that what she was getting at that point in this little course from going through this exercise that we're going through, she got some sense, it sounded like more or less for the first time, she had a sense that thinking was not what, pardon the language problems, thinking was not what she thought it to be, right? In other words,
the schema that you had.
Yes, right. You remember that?
Yes.
Right. She thought that thought was a matter of, like, thoughts was a bunch of schemas or a bunch of things or ideas. I don't think she used that word, but that's the sense I got, right? And she began to see it was much more, although I don't know whether she used the word, a much more active, as it were, living thing. That's what I took her to be getting a grasp of, right? Thinking maybe in either context. I'm not sure. Your question is a little complicated, so you come back at me if I'm not answering it. Thinking about thinking in either context, the preceding or the present, is putting something. It's kind of subverting the whole process. I mean, the whole, as it were, intention, purpose, reality of thinking, which is. The reality of thinking is thinking in some way or another. It's thinking the reality. It's not thinking is not thinking about in that sense. So, to the extent to which we're forced for some reason or another, right? Because even though this is an advance, an essentially new moment, it isn't quite absolutely the end, right? So when we all get to heaven, no one will even need to raise the question. No one will be bothered with thinking about. You see.
Yeah.
Something like that. I don't know. Is that in any way responsive?
I think where I'm coming from is that, I'm used to issues about meta language.
Right.
And, and it just seems to me that whatever the meta language is in this case, there's a different relationship between the meta language and what it's about from what precedes it.
Right.
And also that the nature of the meta language is itself different from the meta languages that precede it. So
okay.
We don't have to go into this, but that's.
No, but I think it's very. I'm interested. I don't know whether we can go into it, but we should have it on the table. I think so. When I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that the difference in the meta language here, and the reason why it is maybe absolutely inappropriate in some way, or infinitely more inappropriate than it might have been in previous thinking, is the elimination here of the resort to any notion of self. So because the distance in thinking about, where thinking actually, I think about thinking, gets me in. I'm not supposed to be thinking about thinking.
Yes.
I'm supposed to be thinking about what's the reality of the world or something. Yes. I'm supposed to be thinking about something, as it were, not thinking about thinking something, right? But where self-consciousness is still reigning, there's more license to think about.
Is perceiving a better word than thinking?
Well, in the thinking now occurring, I would say it's an indispensable word. I don't know whether it's better. I wouldn't compare them. I would say the thinking now occurring is in one way or another identifying perceiving with thinking, but not the perceiving, the Aristotelian perceiving, which is the act of knowledge beyond reason. But as I was saying earlier in a slightly different context, going to the main square, it's a perceiving which is thinking. Right? It's a thinking the object that is a perceiving of it immediately, directly, without the intervening similitude or schema or idea of the object.
How does this differ from immanence?
Another thing I say in the text is that the distinction between the immanent and the transcendent, as the distinction between the temporal and the eternal, belongs to thinking in the past. So again, it's like to the extent to which you can identify conceiving with perceiving, right? To that extent, you can identify immanence and transcendence in a way hitherto not possible. Yeah.
I just want to make one little comment here, which is just to go back to what you were saying about we're not quite there yet. Namely, there's the self-consciousness to want to say what the thinking now occurring.
Yeah, there's a kind of residual,
and from what precedes it and so on and so forth. And when we get to heaven, and just in case anybody's interested, that is the work of Wittgenstein. Just that whole trajectory that you just described, and why he calls philosophy an illness.
Right.
That it is like an illness, and what one seeks is peace.
Right. Which goes back to something Chuck said many meetings ago.
And the dissolution, not the solution of philosophical problems, etc. But I just like the way you said that.
Right.
That was
I got to put one more thing. You're going to plug your Wittgenstein. That this question of, the way I would put it is having to actually undergo the text in order to read it at all. And I don't find that really true of Husserl or Hegel or Descartes, but I do find it true of Heidegger.
And Wittgenstein.
Yes.
Exactly.
That you can't read it without participating. If you do, you come up with a cartoon.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think it's fair. Yeah, and that's why there is a kind of interesting, kind of relationship between thinking now occurring and Heidegger.
Yeah, because
there's some kind of intimate correspondence there.
Some kind
it's too many years since I read Wittgenstein, so I can't speak with any intelligence about it. You understand? I'd have to go back and look at it.
But Wittgenstein is that same thing. You don't just read it in order to extract some propositions. You could do that with the Tractatus, but you can't do that with later.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
I just also wanted to note on page 19 there's a parenthetic, the only point that I've come across where you actually are talking about how you're writing. Or the writing.
Page 19.
Yeah, page 19, and there's a parenthesis on the bottom that talks about the language of the essential history of thought. There's this one moment where you step back text, which I think refers to Nancy's question.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
I have written opposite that, joke.
Right. Well,
is it a joke?
No, I don't think it is. It's not meant to be. I mean, you could make the judgment as a joke, but I don't think that's the intention.
I only perceive it as a joke.
Okay. Well, I gathered that from your comments on the forum. All right. Okay.
Well, Wittgenstein said, why do we take a grammatical joke to be deep? That is the depth of philosophy. Well, there you have it. It's true.
Other observations, questions? Okay, let's try and get closer to, I don't know whether I can resist. Let me take a look at something we didn't do last time. We probably, well, I don't think we need to. All right, let's just jump into alpha today. I think might be the prudent thing to do. And that's on page 303 and following. And on page 303, in the middle, as it were, of that text paragraph, modern thought saw not what remained to be seen, but the thing itself in its essence. That is, that thinking, meaning modern thought, saw the thing itself existing essentially prior to the conception of its nature, just as it essentially saw itself existing prior to its conception of God. And so this refers to something I was provisionally pointing to before, and this issue is going to hopefully be expanded throughout alpha, but something of the immediacy, something of the not looking. This is a thinking that is not sort of, even though it's in some sense, in terms of the attempt to explain it or to talk about it, it's constantly looking over its shoulder. The act of thinking here is a perceiving of the object in which it is not looking over, as it were, either its shoulder or the object's shoulder, keeping in mind that I've already indicated that it's not like we have two different identities here, right? But to the extent to which we make that distinction, so the past, so to speak, and in its own way, the future drops out here. But it comes back, I want to think, immediately in, and this is the so difficult thing to say, that even though the schema has dropped out, you cannot simply say that by any means, quite the contrary, that all difference has dropped out because there's only one identity. You know what I'm saying? So in that sense, identity has to be identically different, and I think that's what creates the. So now I'm looking at this way I'm putting this. I'm trying to distinguish it as, and I do this. I continue to do this in the subsequent pages. That this thinking, the object of this thinking, is what remains to be seen, and that helps me call attention to something, right? Because I think in everyday language, when we say something remains to be seen, I think we inevitably think, well, remains to be seen, like, we'll have to wait a while. We'll have to wait some time and see how. Yeah.
Are you literally thinking of things like, I think it's Francis Bacon in the early days, who sort of tables with the great metaphysical questions and said we've got enough to do just looking at nature as such, and we're going to eventually get to it, and you can sort of observe that 300 years passed and they didn't quite get around to the
If I heard you right, no. But it's interesting. The first half, in other words, what we need to do is, how did you phrase it? Look at the things themselves, which I guess becomes the major.
We have enough to do by looking at what.
Yeah, right, and we can postpone.
Yeah, postpone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the significance of remains to be seen, and that's what I was trying to go. So the question is good in the negative, right? In other words, our first everyday way of thinking, maybe our everyday philosophical way of thinking of something remains to be seen, is kind of a postponement of a decision. It's great. It's great how, it just comes out of your mouth. You didn't. It remains to be seen.
You can't help yourself.
Exactly. And thank God I don't need to. In other words, it remains to be seen what we will decide about something or other. You see? How we'll settle that problem. Now, if I think I've already said in the text, right, that the notion of decision, in the sense of, right, in the sense of a choice to be made, drops out intricately here, right? There's nothing to be decided. It is as if, right, it's already been decided, but not fatally, not by destiny. You see? It's decided in fact. It's not pre-decided. It's not predetermined or determined in that sense, right? The fact obviates, as it were, what otherwise would be the need to decide about the reality, right? And in that sense, so now it forces you to try and actually think what an object remaining to be seen is, when the remaining to be seen has been stripped of the context of postponing a decision about the truth or postponing the decision about the reality of something to some future time, right? So if the object is right now, as it were, remaining to be seen, well, it's a gift. It's remaining to be seen. And in a certain way, but not exactly as if we're going back, but it's again analogous to that receptivity. See? This thinking is, but here the active contemplation, the activity, the creative aspect of the thinking is not an alternative to receptivity, right? So the object remains to be seen by thought. Now, I mean, that is the object, is its remaining to be seen by thought, and so in that sense there's a kind of complete or absolute reception, but not in the sense that there is a thought ahead of time to be there passively receiving this impression made upon it by the object, you see, as if we had a tabula rasa to begin with, right? This impression, as it were, what would be an impression, creates the thought, right?
The object remains to be seen as thought.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm going to hire you. You've made a couple of good observations along the way. Yeah.
So there are two senses of remaining there. I mean,
Yeah.
it becomes present. I mean, it's actually there's no future. There is a future
Well,
sense to
it becomes what Kierkegaard and others, not just Kierkegaard, but Kierkegaard talks about the present. When the eternal enters time, it's then and there that there is a present.
Right.
Okay? So I'm just interrupting you. I don't want to interrupt your thought because I want you to get it out. So, as it were, the present.
So it's remaining.
It's present as it were, but it's
Right.
really just absolutely now.
Right. So it's remaining to thought. Remaining.
Yeah, or maybe to thought, or it's remaining to thought, but as is maybe even a little better in the sense that to suggests this kind of distance, which is there in the notion of presence.
Right.
The presence of one thing to another. So this otherwise presence is so simply an identity of the object and the thought, right? That it in some important sense, it remains as the thought.
Right.
But
Right. And
Okay.
there's also a sense of it. There's a sense of it not. I mean, it's known, but there's a sense of it being open simultaneously, so that there's this.
Right.
There is a future sense to it
Right.
that leaves it open to still. It's still remaining to be seen,
Right.
because it's not going to stay the same, remaining there
right.
to thought or as thought.
Okay, there is some kind of futurity, some sense of that, in the sense that because things are essentially new, the object of thought is essentially a novelty in its being, as it were. Then, in that sense, not on one side of it, you could say there's nothing to be decided about, no decision about the object to be postponed to a later date, as if the object, in the meantime, would remain simply the same, and we would just catch up with deciding what it was.
Right.
Because in that sense, change, you see, and motion, as we say later on, this dynamism is inherent in the very nature of the object.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Which
right.
is the thought
and therefore,
itself.
it would be a futile exercise to,
Right.
it would be the worst mistake to take remains to be seen as we'll see what it is later,
Right.
because there is no, it has no context. It doesn't. Okay. I think I say somewhere in here something like the object and the thought are not contemporaneous.
Yes.
Yes, right? Yeah, you see? They're not existing in some sort of temporal framework. Because we know from reading Kant and talking about Kant, right, that the temporal framework can only be conceived of in terms of space, right? And the temporal framework as such, in a certain sense, is immune to change. Change takes place within it, do you see? But here we have somehow the notion of a, paradoxically, if you want, a time itself, a change itself, a motion itself, a real, I'm thinking now of carding wool, kind of what they separate the tangled, card wool, sheep? Okay. So this is carding, right? Am I got the right? Yeah, it's carding the fibers, the hairs or whatever, right? Separating them out, right? So here, the thinking now occurring, the simplicity of it is that it separates out in a perfect distinctness time, change, and motion. You see, so that they're not, as it were, interdependent upon one another, even though each in its own way is a dimension of the object as thought. Right? But there is a clear distinction between these elements. As I'm saying this was not my intention when I'm writing the text. Another why I don't have to help myself. But it is a kind of a kind of epistemological or ontological analog to the simplicity of the notion of the Trinity, where you can have three relations that are one, but nevertheless the whole doctrine of the Trinity, which for self-consciousness is a big headache, right, is that these three, right, are one, and yet they're really distinct. It isn't true that the Father is the Son. It isn't true. I mean, that's the doctrine, right? So it's analogous to that. And since I'm on that point, it's very interesting to me that one of the last things I discovered was in Foundation, was the analog in Foundation, which I was ultimately came to the point, and you can see it from the book, because the book is pretty much in its I think almost perfectly in its chronological order of creation. Not perfect, but for the most part. In any event, the logic in Foundation comes right about the middle of the book, more or less. And it only came because I was in correspondence with Altizer, and he asked some question which I can't remember. And I gave him an answer to the question. I shot him back a letter, setting him straight. But then, of course, as we do, when we look over that letter we just sent out. It's too late now, right? We look over. And I was thinking about it, and it forced me, or it encouraged me, prompted me to say to myself, what is the logic underlying this thinking that I had been doing at that point for 10 or 15 years? What's going on here? And that was when I decided to try and formulate the logical chapter, so to speak, of Foundation with the 3 digits, the 0, the unum, and the 1, and so forth. All of which is just to make the point here that this is a thorough... So I'm saying, empirically, I would say, based on my experience of the thinking now occurring, its development, that there's something taking place in this thinking which has, joke or no joke, very little to do with me. Right? In other words, it's consistent in ways that as it's putting itself on the page, it doesn't call attention to here. There's nothing. The logic doesn't exist here on this page. It exists in another book 10, 15 years later. And then when I did the logic, my problem in the logic was Boole starts with a 0 and a 1. That's his creation of the symbolic logic, right? And 0 means to Boole nothing, and 1 means it's great. It's great to read the originals, and it's like, it means the universe. It doesn't mean unity. Of course it means unity, but that isn't what he says. He calls it the universe, meaning everything that is. Being, on the whole, being what is in totality, you see, is what Boole really has in mind when he says 1. And nothing is the alternative. And as I point out in Foundation, Boole considers the problem. This is the logical problem. Of course, in first grade, you can add 1 and 0, and you get 1. But Boole, who's so dumb, right, he missed the first grade, he says to himself, can I add 1 and 0, meaning the logical 1 and 0? Can I add the universe and nothing? And he says, no, it's impossible. You can't do that operation in his logic. You can't do it. So it's not that he tries to do it and gets some sort of strange result. You just can't do that for Boole, right? And Peirce, who is a logician, to his core, basically, his basic move is to say, well, yeah, you can. Right? You can. But in order to do it, in Peirce's language, you have to have a logic of relatives as opposed to the logic of absolutes that Boole is working with, right? So that's the essence of Peirce's move, right? To be able to add 1 and 0 and therefore get closer to arithmetic, because in Peirce's relativization of Boole's absolute logic, when he adds 1 and 0, he gets 1. Okay? And just to round out this little digression, I thought to myself, well, conceptually, I've known from the get-go that there is no nothing. So, and on the other hand, you don't want to really start from scratch because you got to explain these things to people like Jim. So you don't want to create a logic with these symbols that no one has ever heard of, right? Just like you don't want to talk about God, calling it a donut, a chair, or something like that. Use the term God. Just say, well, what we have called God before, we need to rethink that, right? But there's a certain practical, right? Okay, so if I'm going to say I'm looking for the logic underlying the thinking now occurring, and at the same time I don't want to discount the language of logic, 0 and 1. Well, I'm easy. I'll start with a 0 and a 1, and I'll add them together, right? So I'm like Peirce that way. The thinking now occurring will add 1 and 0, like Peirce, unlike Boole, you see. But when it adds 1 and 0, unlike Peirce, and in some strange way like Boole, who just doesn't bother acknowledging the legitimacy of the operation, I get a 0 with a line over it. So I don't get a 1. 1 and 0 equal unum. And whatever that means, right? Forget what it means, right? But in other words, and I get it because, and if I get that, if I do that, it just 1, 0 equals unum. As I said to my then-to-be publisher at SUNY, this is what persuaded him to give up all his doubts and publish the book. Who was Bill Eastman, who was an Easterner in every sense of the word, right? I said, look at that. I said, 1 plus 0 equals unum. Well, we don't know what that means. We don't know what unum is, but one thing we do know. If 1 plus 0 equals unum, that's 0. Ain't nothing. That much we do know. Okay.
The problem...
Now, well, let me just finish my thought. And then, now, the reason I went into all of that was, so I wound up 10 or 15 years later with a logic, going back to the distinction here of time and change and motion, 3 things that are really distinct from one another, and yet in some sense are unified in the act of thinking, which is the thinking now occurring vis-a-vis its object. And so therefore, both here implicitly, and then only after I had done the logic, only to have a logic that had no nothing in it, it was only almost on the dawn of publishing the book, which is another 12 years later, that I happened to be teaching a course in Augustine at NYU in a graduate course, and I was reading the Trinity, and it dawned, I'm reading along here, and I was like, there's something familiar about this. Right? And so I started putting little zeros and unums and ones in the margin of the Trinity, and it worked. In other words, everything Augustine says, logically, of the relationships of the 3 persons of the Trinity was true of the logic. But I didn't intend that. Do you know what I'm saying? So that the simplicity, go back to the simplicity notion, which you find, well, we noted it first in Kierkegaard, but it's also there. We alluded to it. We never examined the text in the case of Heidegger, right? But the ambition to a certain simplicity in thought, even in the anti-thought of Kierkegaard, really goes back to that Augustinian notion of the second, not necessarily the second in order, but the second of 2, or the first of 2 characteristics of God, simplicity as well as immutability. Right? And the simplicity becomes very important when you talk about the possibility of there being one being who is really 3 different, distinct persons in the case of the Trinity, or a thinking in which the object of thought is really temporal, changing, and moving in a way that those ideas, those realities, are nevertheless really distinct from one another. They're not confused thoughts or confused aspects of the reality. Something like that. Yeah.
As I perceive you, whatever you're doing here, I shouldn't use the word explaining, but
well, I am trying to explain.
Behind you, there are 6 things that are a tribute to Boole.
Yes.
They are...
Right. The computers.
There are a couple of them over there, too.
Right.
So Boolean logic, whatever its
right.
limitations, has produced this... these things don't speak, you understand. In fact,
right.
their ears have been covered, apparently, in order to permit them to survive in this in this hostile environment that we have here, right?
Well, it's not really hostile.
We're knocking out from under them.
We're trying to help them become more alive.
Well, that's scary. But anyhow, let's just say that let's raise the question of whether the thinking now occurring in the foundational mathematics with this trinary logic, is it going to manifest itself in things, revolutions, whatever, like what's behind you? And if it doesn't, and we don't want to wait for that, of course, we want to dive in right away.
Well,
right?
I think the sooner we stop talking about it.
That's right. But what about that? I mean, until this new thinking impresses, to use your word in that note that the appearance impressing on reason.
Right.
So until this new thinking impresses so that there's a manifestation that's perceptible. Like maybe like this, I don't know. I mean, or maybe this is all an illusion. I don't know. But what about that?
Well,
do we have to wait for that? I mean, I noticed in the response you gave me on the forum that you cited genetic engineering.
Right.
You cited superconductivity,
right.
which you have some claim to.
Right.
I'll admit, but generally speaking, these things, as well as these things behind you, are the products of this old thinking, are they not?
Well, this is another version of the question about, which we did discuss previously in a much more abstract level, the relationship between modern thought and the thinking now occurring. Right? In other words, so there's an essential disconnect, as it were, right? But there's not a simple disconnect, right? That there is a formal clearing of the brush, as I was saying last time, that's undertaken by modernity. So I would say that things like genetic engineering and so forth, yes, in some sense, of course, they are the fruit of modern thought. But McDermott, the American pragmatist, whom I quote in Foundation, I guess, at some length, I don't know. I can't do him justice, but he made the observation. Talking. I think he was only talking because we're moving so fast, right? So he wasn't talking about genetic engineering, whatever it was 15, 20 years ago. He was talking about heart transplants. But yes, without modern science, we wouldn't be having heart transplants. But now he didn't make the leap that I'm about to make, right? But he noted, just existentially, that once you got somebody walking around with a new heart that wasn't their heart, in other words, once you get that heart into that person, wow, that blows your whole idea of the organism. You understand? In other words, the implications of that. And it goes to the Heideggerian question. In other words, Heidegger is anticipating something. I mean, fundamentally. I mean, you could almost say you don't want to do anything more ultimately than be in this anticipatory mode in Heidegger, right? But it's like the difference, right? So the actual doing, and I think this is relevant. Your question is relevant to something we were saying earlier. Again, so your questions are very provocative, right? That in a deep sense, right? The question of the difference between explaining the thinking and doing the thinking is at least analogous to the difference between modern science leading up to something actually happening, which qua actually happening escapes, transcends, if you want, moves us beyond the thinking that led up to it. In other words, once I actually have a new heart, all of my thinking previously is radically called into question about the nature of my living, organically even. You see what I'm saying? So there's a kind of potential of an essential break there. So I don't see it as a necessary inconsistency, but I see it that in the actual achievement of the human genome, in the actual achievement of the fruits of that, right, we're not going to be able to fully, as it were, understand that if we continue to think in the form of the mode of thinking that led up to it.
There's a very interesting example of this kind of thing.
Okay.
In the 60s, you had McLuhan, John Cage, and Buckminster Fuller talking in great detail about how the world was going to be totally transformed by computer reality and electronic information and so forth. And they had this whole vision, this whole thing. Not one of them or anybody else imagined that there were going to be personal computers. That when it actually happened, that is to say, when the computer revolution actually got to a certain degree, the PC is what's changed everything. But nobody anticipated the PC, even though there was a tremendous amount of information about what was going to happen. Everybody knew Turing.
Even IBM didn't.
No, least of all IBM.
Least of all,
yeah.
Right.
Everybody knew the Turing machines, and everybody knew the logic of computers, and everybody knew the power that was going to happen, and everybody knew there was going to be a tremendous explosion in the nature of information that was going to transform everything. But the single thing that actually transformed it, nobody had a clue when it actually happened, and the way it actually occurred was. And so you can take the genome or any of these different things. We know it's going to change everything.
But how
it's going to happen,
right?
We don't know.
Right. But I guess the significance of that particular reference in there, and as a way of responding to your critique, is that the implications of even these preliminary moves that are going on about us, the implications of that are in the direction of thinking now occurring. In other words, that once we get to the point where I can, just keep replicating myself, I've got a real problem. I've got a real human problem. You know what I'm saying? In other words, it's not simply a mechanical problem. And and whether that's what we'll do or how we'll do it and so on, just like we couldn't predict go back, I think, to the most recent question, we couldn't predict the PC, or no one did anyway, whether we could have or not. It's not a question here of predicting. It's really a question of getting on with it. And que sera, what will happen? Will happen, as it were. Be careful there. So I don't think there's a concern for that. I think one of the things that is coming out in Faith and Philosophy, and some of the critique of modernity there, is that, and I noticed it was alluded to in Alpha, very lightly, one word, I think. I forget how I phrased it. I didn't use the word anxiety, but I indicated, right, that apprehension. Right? The thinking now occurring is not apprehensive. Now, that's technical and psychological, right? In other words, apprehension is a grasping, and the I think etymologically, it goes back to the to part in present, to, ad praesum, right? Present, but then ad adds that sense of the distance, the movement too, right? So get rid of the apprehensive, right? The closest you get to it traditionally would be, I think, an Augustinian way of thinking and speaking is a apprehending of something, a kind of immediate grasp, okay? But even grasp, I'm not too comfortable with, right? Because grasp also, imagistically at least, suggests that kind of distance, right? But it's that immediate comprehension, identity of the object perceived and the thinking perceiving it, something like that. Yeah.
I wonder whether this might be the time. It shouldn't take a lot of time.
Okay.
Where you could say something about, because you say it on several occasions.
Okay.
Otherwise than presence.
I don't remember that particular phraseology. Do you have a place?
It's not in here. It's in Faith and Philosophy.
You're cheating. I thought.
I realize
that's
I'm
okay.
cheating.
Yeah.
But you say something about. Can I just read the sentence?
Yeah.
But something excludes nothing. The exception to everything, including nothing, is the absolutely objective being of the I, otherwise than presence. Right. And even before, when you were speaking to Todd, you said something about presence
as distance from
the immediacy.
Yes, right. In other words, being present. Well, you can say, "I am present to something," or "I am present to someone." Now that's like odd presence, right? But I don't need to do that. I can even just say something is present. I'm tempted to say it's present to thinking or present to me, but let's say I leave it out. I just say something is present. In the very notion, presence, praesum, it's the notion, the distance is already built in there. It's pre. The pre is some kind of before, whether it's temporally before or spatially over against, present, right? It's not as opposed to sum, as opposed to, it's interesting even, as opposed to sense. It's good in English, see? You sense something, and notice we sense many things that aren't present, right? Which makes us really feel weird, eerie. It's eerie, right? That you sense something which is not present to you, which is not there in the face, right? You're dealing with somebody, and you sense something, right? But it's not like they're telling you what you're sensing, or there's a picture there, or you see what I'm saying? Okay, so get rid of the pre, in presence, right? And I don't remember the sentence you're quoting at me, but that's where it's going. In other words, otherwise. Now, I say otherwise than presence. If
You
that's
say other than presence, you say otherwise than presence.
yeah, otherwise than presence is playing off. It's nice when other thinkers help you. They do some work. You don't have to redo it. The way in which Levinas uses otherwise than being, what he's really talking about in being otherwise than being, that encompasses being's alternative. In other words, otherwise than being is not just other than being, it's also other, as well as other than being, it is at once other than non-being. It's otherwise than is other than the whole complex, the oppositional complex of being and nothing. So in this, my application of that way of speaking to this issue, otherwise than presence, I don't mean absent. I mean altogether beyond the framework of presence and absence. You see? And that there is a deep distinction, I think, from the Heideggerian situation, because in Heidegger, in some sense, absence is an integral part, right? The abandonment of being, right, is an integral part of the being between that, in some fundamental sense, characterizes Heidegger's anticipatory receptivity, for want of a better term. So, otherwise than presence, neither beyond the categories of presence and absence. But more fundamentally, why? Because beyond the distance implied in both the notions of presence and absence. So even though you say something that's present is not too far away, not absent, yeah, but it's still a little bit absent. In other words, Hegel would appreciate, right? If it's present, it's implicitly absent. Right? Yes, okay, so we want to be beyond that dialectic.
That's the Uno.
Huh?
Sounds like.
Okay.
In terms of a logical.
Yes, and so one way, my first grade way of explaining the difference is, and it goes back to Jim's question indirectly. It wasn't the brunt of Jim's question, but it's related to Jim's question because it touched on something else besides genetic engineering. I don't know what else I mentioned there. Superconductivity and so forth. And then, so maybe I didn't mention it in that catalog, but I'm thinking here of the quantum world and what's called quantum superposition. So in the quantum world, the great promise of infinitesimally small, as it were, or at least invisible computers working on subatomic elements, right? Using the fact that a subatomic element in quantum physics, insofar as it can be isolated from all the other elements in the universe, insofar as it can be isolated, it is coherent, which means that it spins both up and down or left and right. Pick your labels, or it's in computer terms, it's both on and off. It's Schrodinger's cat. You know the image of Schrodinger's cat? Is the cat dead or alive? Well, the only way you're going to find out whether it's dead or alive is when you open the box, because before the box is open, before you look at it, it's both dead and alive. Do you see? I think of Heisenberg now. Heisenberg, not Heidegger, right? And Heisenberg says, we're back. Aristotle's coming back under the woodwork, right? Because that means that we have to, in philosophical terms, Heisenberg, who was hip enough to understand this, quantum mechanics reintroduces a serious scientific idea of potentiality, right? That potentiality is not accidental. It's in the very nature that right. Okay. Just quick. So if you symbolize that in terms of the logical digits, that situation, the coherent particle, that is, to the extent to which it can be isolated, it's both on and off. Or logically, it's both. When we know the computer's Boole's turned on and off, right? You have a computer. Somebody has a computer that you press one, it goes on. You press 0, it goes off. Okay, the light switch, right? So the subatomic particle, insofar as it's coherent, is both on and off, and that has tremendous potential, because if you could create a computer with switches that don't need to be either on or either off, then you can exponentially multiply the number of operations that the computer can do.
That's
you can go
fuzzy logic, right?
Huh?
That's fuzzy logic.
I'm not sure what it's fudgy.
It's dialethetic logic.
Okay, want to comment on that? You want to elaborate?
There are logicians who are arguing that that you could have a logic in which you can accept certain contradictions.
Okay, all right, okay, all right. And
We're sitting on one of them.
okay, now here's the limitation of that situation. So yes, that in other words, quantum mechanics is already a break in the philosophical tradition, which I pointed out in a very different context earlier on in the course, is in principle anticipated in American pragmatism. And Dewey, he said, hey, terrific, right. And American pragmatism is already a break with the continental European self-consciousness. It's already the recognition in principle in American thought that I cannot simply reduce the other or the otherness of reality to being a function of self or self-consciousness, right? Not that American thought gets rid of altogether self-consciousness, as the thinking now occurring does, you see, but it was also a kind of anticipation in its own way. I mean, it doesn't intend to be in the Heideggerian sense of an anticipation of new thinking, but nevertheless, de facto, in a certain sense, looking back, we can certainly see that in a way it anticipates this. All right. So I can have an object, as it were, a scientific object that is both on and off, right? But if I put it in logical terms, what that means is that I have a 1 here, and a 0 here. I have an object, an incoherent subatomic particle that is on, and I have many of them, millions, billions on, and I got a lot that are off. And every once in a while I got one that's both on and off by accident, thanks to the random probabilistic nature of quantum mechanics. I cannot say with any kind of absolute certainty that everything is one thing or the other, you see, or that there's absolutely no situation in which there's one that is both on. I can't exclude that. In reality now, not just in my thinking, right? In reality, the probabilistic aspect at that level of reality is such that there must be, every once in a while, 1 in a million, a particle that is both on and off. 1 in a million is not a lot, right? But
it is if you've got 16 trillion.
Well, yeah, okay. All right. But, right, okay. All right, so what's the difference in the thinking now occurring? Okay, so I have a 1, a 0, and then the one in the middle, the exceptional one, is the way it's typically symbolized is a 1 with a 0 around it. A 0 with a 1 in the middle of it. So to say it's both. Okay. The thinking now occurring is like. Now, of course, the problem is this is very dangerous, right? Because once you make this crossover, like Descartes crossing over, it's a whole new ballgame. And so it's only. Right? But for openness, you could imagine that the 3 digits in the thinking now occurring in the logical foundation are like 3 zeros with 1s in them. You see, 3. In other words, it's not only the exceptional particle that is coherent, but that every particle has that kind of coherence, right? But then you're in a new world. You're in a new universe. So are there anticipations? Yes. Should we rest content with those anticipations? I think thinking now occurring, in effect, is the negative answer to that question. Now, I don't remember what's thought of that, but
rest content.
Just run down to the water and take a short dip. Should we just tentatively recognize the interesting quality of the challenge presented by thinking now occurring, or should we, as it were, jump in altogether, right? So resting content would be not willing to leave the shore.
Yeah.
Right?
But jumping in is not historical.
Well, it's yeah.
Well,
where others feared to
no,
tread.
As I heard you talk about it, he segregated that out.
Well, that's true. That's true. That's a good point. I like that. That's good. He preserved his faith and his moral, practical life. He exempted it. That's right. Yeah, okay.
Just like Chuck needs to have that line, see, back to the authority. Did you read my comment?
It was more difficult than the thinking now occurring.
My comment?
Yeah.
Well, it was intense.
Okay. So I'll meet you halfway on that. But Descartes gives us almost literally an idea of what it would mean to jump in, and it's no accident that people have been jumping in, like Kierkegaard and Heidegger, ever since Descartes. They've been jumping in. Now, I would agree with you. Oh, I like it. And so that's the problem, not only with Descartes, that he didn't jump in without reservation. So you're going to use Descartes as a justification for your timidity when it comes to jumping in, right? Okay. But neither does Heidegger jump in without reservation of the self. Do you see? Neither does Kierkegaard jump in without reservation, because he has to allow in the negative the natural the incompatibility of his nature with his faith. Right? So much so that he dies an excruciating death at the tender age of 42 or something like that. Okay. So are you right that hitherto all the jumping ins have been provisional or tentative or restricted? Yeah. But I don't see any reason to keep us from jumping in without reservation.
It's a human reason.
Okay. Well, that's it. See, but that goes back. It's a human reason. But, starting with heart transplants, artificial blood, re-engineering my genes, it calls into question what does it mean to be human? Now, traditionally, I understand what you're saying, but that's the issue. I mean,
I prefer historical.
Okay.
Not traditional.
Okay. Let's try the text. On page 304, let's say start at the top of the page. To conceive of the universe now about to be left behind is to have been ushered into the perception that what remains to be seen exists now for the first time, which is I think, a succinct way of saying what I was trying to say before, in place of the thing itself, in the sense in which the thing itself in modern thought is associated with the schema, the idea, the representation, with a kind of pre-existence, both externally and pre-existence, as it were, or presence to thought. Right? It is to see that the end of creation exists now, not in the form of past conceptions of God or nature, but now in the form of the appearance itself, in and for thought, of what is required by thought, namely a complete change in being, which in the very essence of appearance itself is now seen to have occurred prior to thought, not therefore as a result of its being what thought now requires. And here the priority to have occurred prior to thought, there is a sense in that sense of history, which is looking back in the past, there is a sense in which the appearance of the transcendental essence, and the way I characterize it in this text, is prior to thought, in the sense that it first, as it were, appears in time, and only now appears in and as the essence of thought. Right? So in that sense, it's prior. But it's very important to keep in mind that that's not the only sense, or even maybe the primary sense in which it is prior, when it comes to the question of the thinking of the object. Because here the priority, all right, the priority to thought of what remains to be seen is what I was trying to point to before. A priority to thought in the object being what remains to be seen. It's being, as it were, not the product of thought, but in some sense, as it were, a gift to thought. Right? Which, as I say that, is some kind of agreement with Heidegger. Right? Heidegger understands that it gives time and it gives being. Right? So I want to say there is an intimate relationship, but Heidegger is still pointing, as it were, across a distance of whatever type, in whatever direction you want to make, that fourfold, onefold, pointing across some kind of a distance, right, to the source. Okay, so now you got rid of the similitude of Thomas. get rid of that distance, get rid of that notion of sourceness, right? And get the gift, or have the gift, and have it as have the object as prior to thought, without it being what was anticipated. In other words, its form is not the object of thought. Now, the form of that object is not in any. It is shed any aspect of being anticipated.
So therefore, any schema.
Yes, that's right. Right. Okay. Okay. So it is seen to be in its effect the appearance of the essence of transcendental existence itself for the first time in and for thought perfectly. Therefore, neither is it seen to be a result of its own being prior to thought. Its priority to thought is seen in the sheer immediacy of its appearance in place of the thing itself as what has occurred in fact. So there's another attempt to state positively this non-existence of the schema. The appearance itself is what essentially remains to be seen to have occurred not before now. And this is where it occurred to me to make a notation about the Aristotelian identity of the knower and the known. Okay, so in order to have, you could put it this way, in order to have, by way of explanation, in order to have an object which is identical with the knower without any intermediating idea, schema, similitude, anticipation, to have what Aristotle had notionally in the identity of the knower and the known, to have it without sacrificing the objective reality of the object. And have the object therefore as what remains to be seen, in the sense in which the thinking now occurring understands history as something distinct from altogether temporality, as history as, in effect, another way of grasping what it means to create the world, right? Then it said, in order to articulate that or attempt to articulate that, it remains to be seen to have occurred not before now. All right. So elsewhere in the text, I think I actually put together the term absolute now. All right. So the thinking now occurring begins now absolutely, and that's when in order to think that, you've got to get beyond explaining it. The thinking now occurring begins absolutely. I can try and explain that, but the more I try and explain it, the less I actually think that, essentially. All right, so the apparent, dropping down a few lines into the next paragraph, a little below the middle of the page, the essentially new form of time itself, in its now evident priority to the indifferent matter of previous change, is the consciousness. All right, so there's no matter. Let me just slow that film down. Right, so the matter of this thought is not indifferently related to time itself. You see? Because really, since there is no nothing, I'm tempted to say awkwardly, there is nothing. There's nothing indifferently related to anything. Everything is differently related to everything in essence for the first time. And therefore not differently related to everything in a purely Leibnizian formal way as one of a number of points of view on the whole. Do you see? All right, so the difference between the formality of the monadology and you could say that there's a kind of an essential monadology going on here. But when I say that somewhere in effect, I don't know that I have to be careful here because Waltraud is actually reading the text, and making notes. So I don't know what I actually say in Foundation, but I don't know whether I would call it an essential monadology, but if I do come close to calling it, and I must come close to doing that because I remember in Foundation the way I make the analogy is that the windows, the monad in Leibniz is windowless. That's Leibniz's way of putting it. And I say that American thought, the monad, the equivalent of the monad in pragmatism, the window is open. In the thinking now occurring, there's no window. The category is it? There's no window. Now that's a problem, right? Because normally when I look at reality, I'm looking through a schema. I'm looking through a window. I'm looking through a lens. Yeah? You see? And so I'm looking through an idea, a representation, an anticipation, or whatever, a worldview, or But this thinking doesn't. It's not enough to merely open the window and look without the intermediate glass, but look without that framework, right? To be outside. Well, see, I was going to say to be outside, right? Because if there's no window, what do you need a wall for? You see, so that transmural nature of the reality of thinking is radical. And so I think symbolically it's very nice. When I make that connection rhetorically in Foundation, that the fall of the Berlin Wall is not just an external political, economic, world historical event, you see, but it's very telling, right? The walls, when that wall came down, it was a kind of pragmatic, everyday way of recognizing, whether we recognize it fully or not, in a editorial sense, that's the end of walls. Right? We can try and put up walls, but the walls are out. They're out. They're gone. In principle.
Except in Israel.
Yeah, but okay. No, well, that goes back. In other words, literally, right? It's not magic, but how can I put it? The foundation for walls is gone. The justification for walls no longer exists. If you're thinking.
Good fences make good neighbors.
Now, I'm not the poet. Well, I used to be a poet, but I would venture the thought that one can read that poem, "Good fences make good neighbors," as an ironic statement.
Something there is that does not love a wall, that makes the frozen ground swell under it, and makes the upper boulders in the sun. The opposite is the viewpoint of the poem.
Okay. All right. So
the received wisdom.
Back into the text on page 304. This, I'm not sure where I left off, but close to where I left off. This transformation is affected by the appearance itself of that essentially tautologous thinking now occurring. The essence of this thinking is the perfectly unnecessary repetition of existence itself, therefore of the appearance itself as thought's object. The appearance itself is the perfectly new matter of thought now existing for the first time, which I think should be more or less intelligible now in terms of what I've been trying to say for the last half hour or so. Although I will pause over the, I think, at least challenging notion of, although I don't think it's challenging philosophically particularly, that thinking is in some sense tautologous altogether. I think you find it challenging?
Well, I find your use of it baffling. I mean, it just
Good.
Completely baffling.
Save it more. But
Yeah, you got to do tautology. If I had read one word, my question, it's that.
Okay.
Because it spins around in so many different places.
Right.
I think I get it, but it's completely intuitive. I think, wow, thinking it's just tautological. But then I have no confidence that my intuition has anything to do with what you're saying.
That's because you're thinking about what you're thinking.
Oh, yeah,
right? The short and sweet way of trying to do that would be to say something like, again, it relates to what I've been trying to point to here and all throughout Alpha, is that it's essentially, well, let's back up a little bit. In other words, it's essentially tautologous because for implication, the tautological nature of previous thought was only formally so, right? And the formality would be associated with the notion that there was something between the thought and the object thought in the way of an idea, right? Now, in Hegel, you get as close as you might possibly get to a kind of perfect tautology because in Hegel, his whole enterprise is to demonstrate that the truth of everything, right, is ultimately seen in the absolute self-realization of the divine logos, that there is nothing outside of itself, right? So in that sense, there is a formal repetition of the otherness of the creation in its absolute. It's interesting, when I think of Heidegger, I can't think of Heidegger without thinking that it's some kind of a Hegelian, like Kierkegaard, which with effect I say in it. The creation in Hegel is a formal tautology. In other words, I'll try and put it in simple terms. Hegel is saying that the world is really the alienated form of God. It's the repetition, it's God over again, in a form in which at first blush, so to speak, if we can cartoon it, at first blush, God doesn't recognize himself. At first blush, he thinks, there shouldn't be something other than me. I'm the absolute, right? But that's a repetition, and it's tautologous because tautos, it's the same thing, right? It's the identical thing. The creator, the creation is the identical thing, and it's logos, it's tautologous, okay? Because it's logic, it's the movement of logic, it's the movement of reason, it's the movement of the syllogism. So in Hegel, there is I'm saying, I don't know whether I say that, I must say it somewhere, but it's certainly implicit if it's not explicit, that in Hegel what you have is a formally tautologous thinking. You have a thinking in which the creation is the rational repetition of the identical being that the creator is, you see. Here, thinking is essentially tautologous. The formality of that relationship, right? The movement as some distance, as some, again, goes back to my notion that we have arrived. In other words, in Hegel, you'll notice not only do you have to, not only this thinking, or the divine mind. There are different dimensions of the same movement in Hegel, right? Not only does thinking, or not only does the divine mind have to go through the movement in order to come to its self-realization in principle, but if you look at the phenomenology of spirit, it's powerful, okay? You have this close in the phenomenology of spirit in which there is a kind of, I think it's Hegel's phrase, and if it isn't, it should have been, but I think it is, that the eternal spirit is understood by him as, and here he not only takes in Aristotle, but he takes in Plato too. He wants to get everybody in the act. It's the eternal recollection of being upon itself. And so that infinite depth and infinite height of the syllogism, in which every conclusion is the start of a new movement, and there's no end to that. But it's okay. See, in Hegel, it's okay because it's all, in principle, encapsulated in the eternal idea, in the eternal living schema, if I can try and bridge the conversation a little bit, see? But the point I'm making is that the internal dynamic of the Hegelian formally tautologous thought, the divine thought, is such that there is this infinite, what Aristotle would have called an infinite regress. Now, of course, the infinite regress or infinite progress is, and so he in a certain sense he includes Kant in there too, right? The infinite regress and the infinite progress, the infinite up and down, right, of the movement of the absolute idea in Hegel is nevertheless accounted for, you see, by what I'm calling the skin of it, the encapsulation of it, as it's the eternal form of what otherwise would be, as Hegel would quickly say, the bad infinite. And the bad infinite is an external infinity, but infinite progress or infinite regress is not bad for Hegel, as long as it's what? As long as it's the real infinity, which is internal to the divine idea, which is not victimized to that, okay? So, an essentially tautologous thinking then would be one, this is just another way of trying to get at, and maybe to position historically, in that sense of the word, the thinking now occurring as the immediacy of the existence of the object as the form of thought for the first time absolutely now. So the notion of the regress and the notion of the progress, right, is essentially eliminated.
Not A equals A, but just A.
Well,
I mean,
yeah, but, well, just A. Maybe, I want to say, like, it's tough to do that. That's kind of, just unums, maybe. And if we had to pick one
okay.
digit, not just A in the sense of, see, if one can conceive of, and I don't know it's easy to do that. I think in the logic, in the new logic, it's conceived of, but again, with no more ease than the verbal text. But if one could conceive of an infinite number of A's, each one was A, and yet each one which was, however I said it before, related differently to everything else in essence, every other A in essence, right? So in other words, yes, just A, but not just one undifferentiated A, but an A that is so much simplicity that it is not an alternative.
But this was my intuition. Was
okay.
The tautology was the simplicity,
yeah, okay.
and the perfect allowing of everything in itself without an interference or
right. But all I want to say, but I think it's important not just to say tautology. You have to say essentially because you want to give the devil his due. You want to admit that historically, in fact, in his own way, Descartes was seeking simplicity, right? And Kierkegaard and Heidegger and Husserl and Hegel. Okay, so it's not just that tautology implies simplicity; it does. But here, what we're saying that this simplicity is somehow rather perfected. And therefore, the tautologous nature of thinking is now essentially so, and no longer just materially or formally so.
Does A equal all 26 letters?
I think so.
Sure,
why not?
Essentially.
Yeah. Right. And why only 26?
Right. Absolutely.
I mean, you got the Greek alphabet and the Hebrew alphabet and so on. So, all right. Okay, so to go back to my
which is absolutely frightening. What did
every word has its own.
What did Henry Higgins say? Something like that.
You said every word has its own alphabet. Are you making that up now, or are you quoting somebody?
No, I just.
Okay. Well, what's interesting is that I do. Where did I do this? Probably again in Foundation, in doing my critique of Derrida, because Derrida speaks of a noun without syntax. And I'm saying in the critique of Derrida that in thinking now occurring, the noun, which seems to be otherwise a dead A, you see, has syntax. So however you just said it is an analogous way of putting it, right? Right? So every A has a syntax. Every A in a certain sense is the alphabet, but that's too simple, you see, because then that's just a more elaborate way of saying every A is simply like every other A, and that's not true. So every alphabet is it's a whole new ball game, so to speak, right? And that's taxing. That's tiring. You understand? In other words, to actually think this, right? I mean, it's tired. You can see it's taxing enough to try and think about it, but to actually think it, there's no time out. There's no rest when you're actually thinking it, right? There's no place to fall back to in the thinking. So it's a pleasure to think about it, relatively speaking. It's all relative, right? Huh?
And
Yes, well, of course, because pleasure and pain, when you're just thinking about thinking, are in the category like self and other, absence and presence.
But
right?
look, can we go back to Chuck? I mean,
okay.
Chuck, it's a great.
We can go back to your version of Chuck. Is that what you mean?
No. I won't do that. But Chuck makes. I mean, I wrote it down here.
Okay.
The tautology of. You correct me if I got this wrong. The tautology of this was baffling. Use the word baffling about all of this. And Chuck's read this stuff 5 times.
Well, but he was okay. Go on.
Now maybe he'll read it differently on the 6th time having had this course. But I'm just saying that that your reply to that is that as long as you understand that it's essential tautology, you should be unbaffled.
Well, but my full reply, which was where I was kind of recapitulating now, notice that when Chuck raised the question, he acknowledged that his bafflement, if that's the word he used, was an alternative to his intuition. So if I were to just say, humanly speaking, which I think I did say, it's on the tape somewhere, go with your intuition in that case, right? In other words, so in the language that we were talking about earlier in this session, what he called his intuition, where he thought he knew what it was, but he was afraid to just stay with that. I would call that at that point he was doing the thinking. And then when he thought about what he thought, when he thought about his thinking, he was baffled.
Well, not exactly.
Okay.
It's the word actually occurs in a number of different contexts.
Right.
And so when it occurs in another time, I suddenly have a doubt that my previous intuition was correct.
Okay.
It is not just that I'm spinning.
Okay.
It is textual.
Textually based. Okay. All right.
Well, I think it's sometimes you're referring to the tautology of the past thinking.
Yes.
And sometimes to the tautology of the thinking now occurring.
Maybe
That's
so,
sort of
and that it's the actual, I mean, it's a question of...
That's the formal versus the essential tautology.
right. Yeah.
But it's something, it's the actual degree of awakeness in reading it. That if I'm, it's not just that, there's a certain thing that happens when I'm at the right angle, and I read it, and I'm clicking, and then something else happens, and it's all opaque. So, I mean, that's the process of undergoing the text. That's what I meant, is that one just has to acknowledge that. I think. I mean, that it's certainly a lot. I got a lot more click than I did 6 years ago.
Right.
How does this compare with contemplation in Buddhism or whatever? If we're going to
Buddhism is
transcend.
better for the eyes.
Well, that's what's wrong with the eyes?
Closed.
No, but I mean, to close your eyes basically is to see.
No.
Is to see, isn't it? Huh?
Don't let's do that. Maybe at the end when I
We're back to
actually.
schemas.
Yeah, I don't have a. Obviously, I'm involved in something other than comparing. That is, that's say I'm resisting a comparison.
I see that.
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Okay. All right. So over on page 307.
Can I
Sure.
a question on 305?
Okay.
The notion of that there is no staying of the world.
Yes.
Is that just a sense of moving beyond a normal spatio-temporal relationship with the world, or what is that?
Well, I mean it. How ontologically, there's no staying of the world.
Okay.
In other words,
Good. All right, good. It's in the.
And it relates to something I was saying to Todd earlier, right? About not postponing a decision. That the object remains to be seen not in the everyday sense of a postponement of a decision about an object that could be assumed in some way, not essentially to be change, an embodiment of change itself, but it was only changing externally, so to speak, right? So in that sense, there's no staying of the world. There's no.
I didn't understand what you meant by the change.
Well, let me come back to change because hopefully we get to that section of the text. Okay, on page 307, third line, essentially, therefore, the measure of time itself is the object of transcendental historical thinking. That is, the measure of time itself is the change itself, there we go, of the object essentially prior to time itself. So now this, just to slow the film down a little bit here. Again, keep in mind now, if it's prior to time itself, the priority is not going to be thoughtlessly taken as a temporal priority, right? It's not like, you sort of say, it's not in traditional terms, it's not a pre-existence, right? It's priority. The priority of change itself is of the change itself of the object is essentially prior to time itself. The easiest way to grasp that, to the extent to which one can grasp it, is what I was alluding to before, the carding idea, right? Prior in the sense that independent of, right? Existing. If I were to speak in Kantian terms, by analogy. It's only an analogy, right? I mean, what's the difference between the a priori and the a posteriori, right? In other words, the a priori of the mind is what is, as it were, available to or known to or in the mind prior to experience, right? So if I say that change itself is prior to time itself, I'm saying that change itself is, as it were, known, or is a category of the thinking now occurring, independent of the experience of time. Prior in that sense, right? In other words, the independent, discrete, perfectly discrete category or notion of change in the thinking now occurring, perfectly discrete or distinct from time. Not that they don't form really distinct elements in the object thought, but they are not confused in and of themselves. They're not, and they in a certain sense, their reality does not depend upon one being prior to the other. Prior to the other. That's not the correct way of putting it. The reality, they are prior to each other, but they are perfectly prior. That is, the unity of change, time, and motion takes place only takes place absolutely now in the existing object of thought. And therefore, as it were, the relation of these three, right? If it only occurs absolutely now in the object of thought, qua thought, then they are perfectly discrete. That is, there's no possibility of their being interrelated apart from the actual act of thinking now occurring. So in that sense, each of them is separated out from the others, even though in the act of thinking they are one, if I were to put it this way, insofar as they are different aspects or different dimensions of the that inform the object. Right? So they, in the objective thought, they are equally present and equally the one object thought.
But that you're not going to, in various forms of thinking before now, you could have an abstraction of time as a framework,
right?
Or you could have a notion of change as change in position, or change in quality, or change in something else, or you could have motion as motion within a framework. And what you're saying is those abstractions which keep them apart and make them capable of being thought in terms of their own systematicity, and then other things that are reducible to them, all that's gone.
Yes.
And you only have the apprehension by thought itself of an object which has intrinsically these three aspects.
That's right.
There is an internal process of change, the most paradigmatic aspect of which would be the change to the thinking now occurring, say, or the change in being that is the absolute change to thinking, and that's the paradigmatic instance of what change would be. And similarly, there would be instances of what time and motion would be in relationship to the thinking now occurring and other things, as opposed to the way that they would be abstracted in various different versions of previous thought.
Yes, I think that's a very good summary of what I'm trying to get at in responding to Adam's question. And so that unification only doesn't occur abstractly, it doesn't pre-exist in some sort of abstract set of frameworks.
There's no model theoretical space in which these things have their absolutely...
Right. And therefore, what I was trying to get to, which I think is implicit in Chuck's summary, is that no one of these three is in any way conditioned by or preconditioned by one or the other, or the other of the others. Right? And that's what I meant by the kind of discreteness, the carting out.
I mean, in a way, it does actually, it's another way in which it pulls an Aristotelian idea, in the sense that Aristotelian, one of the things that's difficult in reading in Aristotle is that the word that gets translated change, or the word that gets translated motion, is the same word.
Mm-hmm.
So kinesis, like our word kinematic and so forth, has the sense of a change in quality, not only, or a change in mind, and not only a change of motion in some kind of physical space.
Well, there's certainly an ambiguity in the translations.
But I think that the word has a different segmentation of the semantic field in the Greek than it does in English.
But another difference, another fundamental difference, would be that in Aristotle, as in Plato, change is some kind of a deficient state, right? In other words, it's held over against an unchanging reality, right? And an eternity which is an alternative to, and in the sense in which Jim was using the word earlier, transcendent to. Eternity, in some sense, transcends temporality. It transcends the world of motion and rest. It really is. In other words, when you speak of the unmoved mover being at rest, you're really speaking in an Aristotelian way. You're really speaking analogously. You know what I mean. In other words, and not in the deep. It's not in the deep sense. It's already taken root by the time you get to Thomas, right? It's really an analogy only. You know what I mean? It's not really an analogy of being in Aristotle, right? So the unmoved mover is at rest externally, so to speak, but it's not. Rest doesn't really apply as the alternative to motion. Right? Just as eternity is not everlastingness, or that kind of thing. So I think the deeper difference is that here, change, just as this thinking identifies the knower and the known, like Aristotle, but very unlike Aristotle, insofar as now we've got a transcendental reason that is identical with the objective reality of its content, as it were, right? It's objective reality. It's right. Analogously, so therefore we now have a perfectly transparent consciousness that has, as it were, something of that unique quality of the divine mind in Aristotle. Okay? Analogously, change itself in this text is not an alternative to an unchanging something or other, divine or otherwise. Right? So, and then in that deeper sense, there's no staying of the world. Right? There's or as I put it someplace, I think, I don't know whether in this text or the other one, but it should be in here somewhere. Identity, just as difference is not an alternative to identity, I mean, change is not an alternative to identity. Okay. So, or another way of putting it is when I make some allusion to this because I eventually put this in a kind of physics-like notation at the end of this chapter. The object of the thinking now occurring is not something constantly changing. Just say it's not something in a pre-existing framework in which you could step back and say that the object is. You can say it's changing if you want, depending on the context. You could say, but then you have to say it is essentially changing and constantly is irrelevant. It's the wrong category at this point. Something like that.
You mind if I go back to what Chuck said?
Okay.
Just so I get it down here. I wrote it that the unity of change, time, and motion takes place in the absolute now, the thinking now occurring. But that those three elements are in the object, not in some factor outside of the object. Do I have that right?
I think that's a fair summary.
Yeah. Well, not in some intellectual framework in which you could separate them out and talk about change in terms of motion, or motion in terms of time, or time in terms of change, and separating out those things because you had a setup that allowed you to treat them as particular kinds of abstractions.
Or I think another way in which eventually, again, maybe more so in foundation, if you think of these concepts, thoughts, categories, whatever you want to call them, notions, time, change, etc., as in some, I don't know whether, by the way, Kant would buy all of this, but let's say if in any sense they are a priori, I think another abstract way, direct way of saying what I heard Chuck saying was that in effect, in my language in foundation, the a priori is not an alternative to the a posteriori. Right?
Well, there's an amazing passage in Hart Crane, the Bridge poem, the famous poem about Brooklyn Bridge.
Again, I have to go back and read these things. I know what you're talking about.
This is a poem about the Brooklyn Bridge. The whole thing is about the Brooklyn Bridge, but it's describing sort of the movement of light over the Brooklyn Bridge as the day moves, and and thee across the harbor, silver paced, as though the sun took step of thee, and yet some motion, ever unspent in thy stride, meaning the stride of the chords of the thing, implicitly thy freedom staying thee. Implicitly thy freedom staying thee. So you have this image of this eternal-like structure, but that's taking place in time because the sun is moving across it. And so you're constantly getting this giving the image of motion and change and time, and also taking it back in terms of eternity. So you have exactly this kind of sense in which the concept of time and eternity have refused to separate themselves out from each other.
Okay, all right, close.
I mean,
notice he uses the word staying.
Yeah, but it's done in such a way that it's not. You use it too.
Well, in the negative, I think.
Well, first you use it in the positive, and then there's but it's.
Yeah. Okay.
Staying. You're referring to the word staying there?
Yeah.
I don't.
You say not the thing, but its history is the stay of the world.
The stay of the world.
Okay.
But
right.
no, there's that.
Okay. All right. Okay.
But implicitly, like freedom staying thee. So
yeah.
There is no staying.
Yeah. All right. I'll concede that. I'm not totally happy with the first part of the image, but the second part I'll accept that reading of it. Okay. All right. I want to move a little further in. Yep. Were you about to say something, Ann? Were you making a gesture or a noise?
No.
Oh, okay.
Please go on. I'm still not clear on this.
Which?
On our discussion that we just had. I mean,
about the staying?
Yeah, but we can move on. I think it's the essence of alpha here, really, is this notion of the distinction between time, space, and change.
Well, what I was alluding to when I was wanting to hold off some reservation about the Hart Crane quote was that the first part of it does take somewhat seriously this, I don't know what you would call it, evanescence or something. Right. In other words, so that the stayed by one's freedom is a kind of an alternative, or
silver paste.
Right.
Okay. So there's a pace in the image. So you have an image that looks like it's standing there, except there's a movement in it.
Right.
Silver paste, as though the sun took step of thee.
Okay.
Now, that crazy phrase to take step of something would be to measure the step, to take it in a sequence. But as though the sun took step of thee, and yet some motion, ever unspent in thy stride, implicitly thy freedom staying thee.
Okay.
So there's a potentiality that is completely inside of the activity. It's not
good. That's what I'm picking up, and what I'm resisting there,
is that,
even though I like it, and I'll concede the verbal similarities, is that this freedom staying is in your language, which I think is at least fair, potentially there in the thing. It's hidden, or it's underneath, or it's the deeper portion.
Oh, I see.
You see? So I want to surface that otherwise potentiality, right? I would say there is, in that sense, nothing but a surface of freedom. That's another
So
way.
you're having eternity and time simultaneously without there being
Not
anything
simultaneously.
Well, okay, so, inter-inanimate.
Right.
Inter-inanimating each other without there being any residual hiddenness, potentiality.
Right. Nothing is hidden.
See, but that's my main question, is this notion of change, which is why I was harping on the difference question earlier.
Okay.
There's this. This is not a world of like a static hunk. I mean, there's this potentiality, there's change, and so forth. The only way I can grapple with it is to basically make time, space, change an object equal to the bottle of water or something, in the sense that it's not like a field or some kind of field, and then there's the bottle of water in that field that the bottle of water is subject to, but rather time is an object to
like the bottle of water.
Like basically the same as the bottle of water.
Oh, well, wait, that's the whole issue. Is it like the bottle of water, or is it
the same?
The bottle?
It has to be the same.
It is the bottle of water. It is the bottle of water, and even though, now remember, this is my first book. Give me a break, okay? So I sometimes use the word same, and every once in a while I'll put own, and I would cross it out now, right? Okay. So even though I use the word same here, I quake when I read it, because in Foundation it became clearer to me that same has to go. So identity and sameness are not the same. But speaking loosely, and the warrant for that is we're reading Novitas Mundi, the time, space, change are the same as the bottle. I would prefer to say now they're identically what the bottle is. Well, the bottle is what time, space, change is. Are.
Okay.
Right? Okay. Now, this was interesting to me. A little discovery I made, which I don't think I intended consciously at the time, but I can't tell 30 years ago what I intended. On page 310, speaking of the thinking now occurring, it faces squarely up to the fact that the universe, constructed by thought before now exists in and for thought. The truth is that thinking now conceives itself to exist in transcendence to the essentially complete construction of its own being. And there, depending on how you read that sentence, I might now prefer to bracket own. On the other hand, I could leave the own in and take the meaning of that sentence in this historical, in this over-the-shoulder kind of explaining kind of relationship, where the thinking now occurring exists in transcendence to modern thinking, which was in the business of constructing its own being, right? So that the thinking now occurring now would be in the context, it would be doing a construction. It would be a construction, creation of the reality that it thinks, but that reality that it thinks would no longer be as it is in the self-consciously organized consciousness. It would no longer be the object constructed, would no longer be its own being. You see? All right. So then, what interested me, in terms of a question that you asked a couple of meetings ago on the forum, is I'm reading along here. It says, it now appears that thinking itself is something more than it ever appeared to itself to be before now. The constructor, in essence, of things that exist beyond thought, left behind in the form of time itself. Now, that's another way of trying to get at this, the object remaining to be seen, as it were, in and as the identity of thought. Okay? It appears now to thought that it wields an infinite responsibility, right? Its every judgment is a world in existence. The question of truth appears to be, this is what interested me, the question of truth appears to be the question of the being of everything, right? Now, I say that, and I'm thinking, well, where have we touched on this issue before? Well, we touched on this issue when we were reading Heidegger, and Chuck raised the question of das Seiende, what does it mean, and how could that be translated existence? And the answer was basically that it is being in the sense of beings, that is, it is being or beings, parenthetically, over against being, which is where Heidegger's at, right? He's into being, because he's part of this thinking we've left behind, even though he's a kind of radically attenuated form of it, as I say in the chapter on Heidegger. So, what's interesting, and this is kind of like, this is a joke, as it turns out. But I don't say it was intended. So now, if the Heideggerian question is the question of being, notice what this text says. Not the question of being. The question of truth appears to be the question of the being of everything, of the das Seiende im Ganzen, right? Of being on the whole. The question that this thinking is addressing is not the question of being, which was addressed by the thinking that was in the business of constructing its own being, right? But this is a thinking which is in some sense essentially and absolutely, depending on the context, objective, right? Whose content is not its own content, even if it is its construction, right? By way of a receptivity which is not an alternative to a creative activity, right? And therefore, it's quite consistent that if there is, now here's what I want to do, I want to say this because it texted and I want to take it right back. If there were to be, in Heideggerian terms, a question of anything like being in the thinking now occurring, it would be a question not of being, but a question of being on the whole. It would be a question of existence. And of course, by now, by page 310, we ought to know that the question is no sooner asked than it's been answered. Right? In other words, the object is no longer thought, but that it remains to be seen. Right? You see? So as it were, I would say, if I rewrote the sentence a little bit, I would make it more clear. Right? But if there is any question, the question is the question of existence, in the sense that Chuck was resisting it on the forum. It's the question of the being of the world, or in this sense, of the universe. Right? But now, of course, we have to strip away from this universe of being, or this universal being. We have to strip away from it, in the context of what we were just saying 5 minutes ago, all these traditional frameworks of time and space and change within frameworks. Right? So if you have the being on the whole, right, a plurality, an absolute simplicity, or an absolute particularity of beings, A's, no one of which is the simple replica of any other one, to say, then that's, as it were, the question of the thinking now occurring. But it's a question which is answered. It's not an outstanding question.
See, there are these two different aspects of the Heideggerian issue. And one is it can look as if it's an ontical question. It can look as if it's a question waiting to be answered that just hasn't happened yet.
Right.
On the other hand, it's this embedding of open interrogatoriness into particularity itself. And you're saying that this actually occurs. Right. That my question, question in this thing that I didn't put up there really comes down to is, are we to understand that the thinking now occurring is just putting the question back in the box? And you're answering it here saying, no, the question actually occurs in each A. The actual condition of the question in the important sense, not in the sense of
an unanswered question.
Of an unanswered question.
That was my sense of remains to be seen.
Yeah,
exactly.
Which?
Of
what he's saying?
Exactly what he's saying there.
No, that it's not.
Say it. I want to make sure.
Well, I'm not sure if I can say it.
Say it in your own words.
So it's that remains to be seen. It's not a question. I mean, there was an openness. I said that before.
Right.
So it's not that you don't know what it is, or that something doesn't know
what
it
is.
It's
not
you don't have to decide it for the
future.
future, but it's something that the totality is there, yet it's not.
Well, I think you could. If I'm hearing what you're saying and what you're saying, and the valid sense in which it's a question, it's not a question that remains to be answered.
No.
Okay. But maybe there's a justification for my having let the word question pass here, because question suggests, again, an objectivity. It's not in other words, it cuts through the possibility that I own this thing. Right? It's another way of acknowledging that distanceless difference between the object and the thought of which the object is the identity. That's it. Right? So in that sense, to the extent to which it's a question whose answer is not outstanding, it's the remaining to be seen, the giftedness of the object to thought as thought's identity. Thought is absolutely full of something that it is not a function of its of any kind of owning, including the en-owning of Heidegger. Yeah. Yeah.
When you hyphenated everything in that same...
Now I gotta get this.
310.
We're on 310.
Same
Okay.
paragraph.
Okay.
Of the being of
everything. Yeah.
Thing.
Yes.
Now, are we to take the? Could you basically put a slash after that and say everything? I mean, it is the.
You want to leave the hyphen and then just put a slash and put everything unhyphenated.
Yes.
Interesting.
But it couldn't.
I resist.
But it wouldn't
I would.
be war. It would have to. It would just be.
Yes, it would be. Yes. That's good. That's good. Yeah, you could put a slash there, but it would be ambiguous.
With and, but I don't think.
I would.
Isn't there an identity between everything and everything?
Yes. I mean, yes, but what?
But one suggests that somehow you know the impossible, that you have actually assembled the totality of the infinite space, and in that sense, everything. And when actually the sense of the totality that you know isn't that, it isn't something that a reasonable response to it would be like people who can't read Heidegger, they think, well, this is totalization in the sense that it's the presumption that you know everything when there's no possibility of knowing everything. Obviously, the world is multiple. There's an infinite multiplicity of things. How could one person out of 6 billion have the chutzpah to think that they can know everything? And yet, that's not the sense that's intended. It isn't that intended. So saying everything means that each thing contains the sense in which it has an ontological relationship to the whole. It's not that it knows the whole, but that, this is the simple, basic Heideggerian position, is that every being, even the least authentic ones, thrown and lost in its nothingness, comports itself understandingly towards the whole of being. But that's what human beings do. You listen to the guy in the diner, and you get an immediate sense that he knows everything. Not in the sense that he knows in detail everything, but that he has a relationship to being as a whole.
But if there is an essential relationship between everything, and everything, then tautology is in fact prescinded.
Well, I hear Chuck to be giving his understanding of Heidegger's understanding. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. I haven't yet signed off on either understanding.
I'm trying to help you out here.
I know, but I'm just trying to clarify, make sure we're all on the same different wavelengths. My initial response to your initial question is that I didn't do. I love hyphens and slashes. I love slashes. So I don't think it's. I resist your suggestion of putting the slash, either in the sense, certainly in the sense of an or, and then Adam was saying, well, the slash could be read as just another version of saying every dash thing. I resist that because I want to resist any suggestion of the schema, of the abstract totality. I don't want to deny a notion of totality, but I want to say that identity is absolutely totality. It need not, the identity of anything or the identity of any thought need not, that's how absolutely particular the situation is, it need not refer outside of itself or beyond itself, either in some fatuous claim to possess the whole, or in some acknowledgement that there's more to be discovered, more to be known, right? That something remains to be seen in that other external sense. I'm thinking I could be Hegel here, and I could say there's the good remains to be seen, and there's the bad remains to be seen.
I mean, you could have just taken the hyphen out here.
I know. No, I'm not. I'm very comfortable with
that. You say
hyphen.
everything.
Right.
You don't need a hyphen to say that.
Well,
but
yeah.
There's a resonance between everything, each individual thing, and the fact that it's a relationship to the whole, that the hyphen is communicating. If you took out the hyphen, it would just be the particulars without that, and it would just.
Is that what the author intended?
Yeah.
I tell you the truth. You'll have to say it one more time. I don't want to say it.
There's a resonance
right
between each particular thing,
right.
everything,
right,
and the ordinary word everything, which suggests the absolute totality. That resonance, a trace, a tincture of the totality which is retained.
Yes.
That wouldn't be there if you took out the hyphen.
Yes, I think that's right. In the sense of which I was trying to explain it a moment ago, that the thinking now occurring is not averse to the notion totality, but the totality cannot be any more than space, time, and change can be taken abstractly apart from the object of thought. The totality cannot be taken apart from this thing. Right?
And that's why it couldn't be everything and everything, because then you would need the Levinas otherwise kind of concept in there.
Okay. Yeah. Right.
Because you're going beyond. It's not like you're combining
right.
being, capital B, and beings. It's not like you're combining that.
Or it might be, I think, not too loosely, but the thing comes into my mind, or it might be a form of going back to Leibniz, in which everything is a total part. Right?
So this is a new word.
Well,
a new word is part of
in the context, the significance of the word.
Everything hyphenated is
yeah, but I don't want to worship the words. In other words, yes, it's a new word. It's a new word in the context. It's a new word in the fullest sense of the it's a new thought.
Well, it's an interesting word. I didn't
okay.
focus on it.
Okay. Yeah, but I mean, I'm not trying to. I'm not. The point is not to coin a term. Okay. But yes, I think substantively it is a new word in the sense of the expression of a new thought.
Is the hyphen the unum?
I don't know. I don't know.
I have a small question
okay.
about the rest of that sentence, which
okay.
is what's meant by weight? Perfectly good right to everything from the conception of its own weight.
Yeah, well, that's interesting.
I almost want to say the weight of its own conception.
Yeah, I think, however, well, what's interesting to me when you ask the question is that I don't think I think the meaning of the sentence, the thrust of the sentence, is the conception of its own weight. In other words, again, it's not a question of getting rid of altogether the notion of totality. Analogously, the issue here is not so much that something may or may not have weight, but that its weight is not its own. I think that's the primary thrust of that. But that's difficult. I don't think it's the whole answer, because I think later on there is the suggestion. I think it's more than a suggestion. I think explicitly I want to say that the object, the physical object, in effect, in some sense, is without momentum, and if momentum is a function of weight in some sense, then the question of weight by itself is an issue here, right? But maybe if we get a little bit further in, okay. All right.
I just wanted to say, that coming over here,
okay.
It seemed when we were stuck on the George Washington Bridge, and I assured Pat there was not a problem because the bridge was moving quite nicely, thank you. This was the thing you were focusing on, right? This question of truth and the question of being and everything.
I'm not sure that I make the connection to your remark, but Yeah, this was a
This
passage
was-
I spent a lot
this
of
was
time
the
on.
passage
And I
you-
spent some time on the word, the every.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The everything? Okay.
Okay, sorry.
All right. All right, let me see what we can.
Well,
So
so
it's
your
pro-
apprehensive that you were looking
Yeah.
for.
Okay. What page is that?
On 311.
Okay. I don't want to pause on it now. I want to rush on to maybe 318 and 319, which is it gets back to the most important, what I think to be the most important idea in this appendix, which we've been discussing in many different ways, that otherwise difficult to delineate difference between the object and the thought of whose identity it is, right? And leading into that, probably coming off a discussion of Heidegger, at the very bottom of 317, the essentially redundant formality of modern thought is pervasively evident as the meaning of things, or because meaning, again, is another mediating, another lack of immediacy, so to speak, an intention, a gap, a space, whether it's temporal or logical between the thinker and the thought, right? So when I think of, so another way of putting
Excuse
what
me, where are you again?
well, I was starting at the very bottom of 317, very last sentence,
Now we're at 3.
and then going over onto the top of 318, the meaning of things at the top, right? So what we were talking about, another way of putting it is that this is another way of saying the thinking now occurring is not intentional, right? It's another form of that. But the trick being, the subtlety being, if intentionality means to somebody like Husserl, if genuine intentionality is the alternative to solipsism, you understand? In other words, if consciousness is consciousness of something, not of itself, okay? That part, that is the distinction between consciousness and its object, is not meant to be obliterated or erased or denied, right? But is to be intensified, right? In the direction of saying that there's no possibility of discussing consciousness sans the object of which it is the consciousness, right? And that's what I'm getting at when I'm talking about the object, in a certain sense, being in and as the thought of it as that thought's identity. So there's no, in that sense, speaking a little loosely, there's no pre-existing consciousness any more than there is in this sense a pre-existing object. Right?
As opposed to the Husserlian structure, which is solipsistic, really.
Well,
In the sense
I'm
that-
sure he would argue with you. But
but it is almost solipsistic in the sense that intentionality there is a description of the structure of consciousness. So that the way in which an object is given for consciousness is part of consciousness.
Okay, all right. Well, that goes back to something. So in that sense, the fact that he brackets, that he need
Brackets in order to
have the phenomenological epoche in order to engage in this is a kind of, in the negative, testimony to the certainly a real, minimally a solipsistic danger, if not reality. Okay, and so if we get rid of these, so I said when Alia brought up this question, I think, or somebody brought it up a meeting ago, I said, well, the thinking now occurring, which I think I say something like this in Foundation, is a kind of absolute epoche, which is just a way of trying to say the bracket, as it were, is so complete that there is no reference beyond, right? And therefore, which is like the big picture outside view of this absolute identity of the object and consciousness, right? You see what I'm saying? So it's I really, I'm speaking a little loosely there, but it's like, as it were, as if you had taken the bracket to the point where you couldn't really notice that there was a bracket, right? That there was nothing to bracket left, so to speak. Right? And then you've turned yourself. All of a sudden, now you've walked through the door. Go back to Jim's earlier question. You see, it's like stepping across a threshold. And there's only one way. It reminds me of Kierkegaard and Lessing, right? There's only one way to leap across the ditch, and that's to do it. Okay. Well, if thought arrives at a certain point, it's brought to a certain point by its history, in that other sense of the word, right? The only way it can move on is to cross that threshold. But once but that crossing the threshold is the act of thinking. I mean, and it's an act that leaves off all of the preparation and anticipation as you approach the doorway, right? Now, of course, the metaphor breaks down because I want to say, as I said, there's no window here. In a sense, this doorway is such that when you walk through it, you're in a world where there are no doorways, right?
The door closes.
Yeah, well,
Or this,
yeah, right, yeah. It is a real, unprecedented novelty here, right? In that
But
sense.
it doesn't have to be. You can leap across the ditch, and you can leap back again, and you can go back and forth a number of times, and then you can decide to build a bridge.
Right.
It's not the same ditch.
All right. All right.
Can't step into the
That's
same
not
ditch,
the
Mike.
Okay, so just on page 318 and 319, I just want to zero in another way of trying to get at. Oh, is that a different everything with a dash in the middle of it? Line? Yeah, okay. Everything in transcendental historical thinking exists essentially without belonging, and therefore you don't want a simple everything which creates a totality of which everything is a part of
Well,
some.
where are you now?
I'm still at 318.
Yeah.
Fifth, sixth line down. Everything in transcendental historical thinking exists essentially without belonging, essentially because existence is no longer conceived as a thing of the past that itself has come into being by changing. And dropping down another 5 or 6
Well, wait, can I
Yeah.
ask you to go back?
Okay.
To use everything unhyphenated, the second line of this paragraph, and then
Oh, yeah.
everything.
Right. Well, that's very good. That's the whole point. In Heidegger, the object belongs to everything. It's right. It doesn't have the kind of perfect particularity or simplicity or simpleness of being that existence, TS, have in the thinking now occurring. And so, yes, when you're talking about belonging to everything, then the hyphen isn't there. Right? But that's a reference backwards. In the next sentence, everything with the hyphen is referring to everything in transcendental historical thinking, and the thinking now occurring exists essentially without belonging, essentially because existence is no longer conceived as a thing of the past, that itself has come into being by changing. I wanted to drop through another 6 or 7 lines in mid-sentence there, but in history, in an occurrence that brings time into existence for the first time, that makes time essentially new, that makes it time itself, or now, the form of an essentially new appearance. This is the essence of an essentially new universe, seen now for the first time in thought, the essence of which is the essence of history, a thought which therefore is identically what it says has occurred to it in the course of time. So now I'm kind of wrapping around that notion of the identity of the storyteller and the story here. Okay. Over on page 320, in the first paragraph beginning on 320 in the 4th line, but it is the universe now existing in an essentially new form. Objectively, this new universe exists in a state of pure motion, essentially distinct in existence, essentially constructed by that thinking now occurring. Pure motion, or motion itself, as the essence of the object, qua object, is not to be confused with the absolute motion of past thinking. Carrying this idea over onto the next page, maybe beginning at the bottom of 320, through the mediation of the mere appearance, 3 lines up from the bottom of 320, of the mere appearance of modern thought, the motion itself of the object existing beyond its universe exists by extension beyond every previous universe known to thought, in whatever way, including that universe in which motion exists remote in essence from thought's transcendent identity. There you could understand, for example, Aristotle's universe. In pure motion, an essentially new thinking conceives its object existing without the limitation in essence of its past position, which in a way I've already said, but I want to nail it down in the text. Existing without the horizon in essence of direction, without temporality in essence. It exists now as the appearance itself of a change, complete in essence, prior to its pure motion in the form of time itself. You want to say anything? Okay. In the middle of page 321, motion itself